Well, South Africa has announced that we will be withdrawing membership from the International Criminal Court. That's 2 weeks after Burundi said it would pull out of the ICC. Now, to help us understand this new trend, it seems, from African states, is Siaduma Beniza, who is Finance and Operations Director at PESA. Good evening to you.
Hi.
Why are we doing this?
Well, look, our involvement in the institution has always been questionable, and this was drawn up especially strongly last year when we had the visit by al-Bashir. And there was a lot of commotion around this. You know, should South Africa hand him over to the ICC? And obviously there are political sensitivities about this. But as far as you can tell historically, and the current perception of the ICC is that it's out there to indict particularly African leaders, and it is being seen as a political tool of the superpowers, whether it be those in control of the UN Security Council, who have a direct impact on what cases and what leaders are pursued, or just simply the US in terms of it supporting its foreign policy through indictments conducted
Looking
by
at the
ICC.
Bashir case, wasn't it the right thing to do to arrest him, never mind whether the ICC said we should?
Well, the issue is that it's not necessarily about his arrest, whether it's the morality of his arrest, more than it is about South Africa's involvement in that arrest and what that shows in the political, in the geopolitical realm about South Africa's stance on the institution as well as its alignment globally.
So now we've got Burundi going out. Is this two countries isn't a trend, but is there a trend coming?
Well, certainly from African states, and if you remember, perhaps last year, Namibia also announced that it's making plans to exit from the ICC. But I do think that there is a general trend that's going in that direction. But this is not necessarily a negative thing. And it also is about African states taking the prerogative and deciding what and how to deal with their domestic challenges.
But then there's the issue of, do you replace this with an African body which would play a similar role? And then there's talk also of a new ratings agency which will be created by and perhaps regulated in some way by African countries rather than first world ratings agencies. Is this going to happen?
Well, there is progress in the African Union, at least, to create the African Criminals Court. However, that is still a work in progress, and as you know, all multilateral processes take forever. However, the positive thing is, though, that through the regional integration process, we've seen that countries have now increasingly held each other accountable, because we understand that there are spillover effects, that if there's conflict in, say, Lesotho, that will spill over into South Africa and neighboring countries. And so countries have taken the opportunity through regional economic communities, whether you call it economic governance or political governance, they have taken that platform as a way to hold each other accountable, and which we've seen particularly in the case of Lesotho more recently, and other African states that have been held accountable by their counterparts in these regional economic communities.
Is it true that, as I've seen alleged, is that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, does tend to focus on African transgressions and ignores others in other countries?
Definitely.
Do the facts bear that out?
Yes. So if you look at the number of indictments, the ICC is 39 public indictments currently. Of the 39, all are African leaders. And the other 10 that are sort of in the preliminary investigation stage, most of those are African states, and only 2 are outside of Africa. I think it's Afghanistan.
Who should be indicted that is not being indicted?
Well, particularly people talk about the UK's involvement in Syria and the US's involvement in Syria and the Middle East generally, and how those leaders have seemingly have been given a pass, whether it is through the ICC's non-action or through blocked moves in the United Nations Security Council. So the US has repeatedly used its political power to evade the clutches of the ICC, whether it be through political moves on whether they're signing onto the Rome Statute or not, and last-minute moves to ensure that its allies vote against the indictment of American citizens through the ICC. They've used their political power to avoid. So a lot of the superpowers have been able to evade the clutches of the ICC.
So in the United States, for example, what should they be indicted with? I mean, what is war crimes? Is it What is it?
Well, the issue of the United States is quite complicated because historically and traditionally the ICC would indict based on domestic infliction. So, for instance, it would be Kenya who would take its leaders because it either cannot indict them domestically or there's just no will judicially, and that's the kind of cases that you follow up. But in the case of the United States, well, some would argue that it has a case for domestic human rights violations, whether it be from people from the Black Lives Matter movements or whether it be people who are against the operation of facilities such as Guantanamo Bay, which is also kind of in an uncertain space in international law, because although it is operated and owned by the United States government, it doesn't operate in the United States jurisdiction, it operates in the Cuban jurisdiction. So there are all these sort of loopholes that the United States has been able to avoid. But in terms of what exactly it should be indicted for, it is definitely its involvement in wars throughout the Middle East and some other parts of the world, as well as some of its own domestic, human rights violations or crises that it's currently facing and has faced in the past.
How long is this process going to take? And while it happens, are we still obliged to submit to the rules of the game?
Well, the current so the process now has been passed through Parliament, and we're now reversing our sort of ratification of the Rome Statute. And what this means is that we're no longer sort of members of the ICC, but we can become sort of signatories of the ICC. And what this means is that we're not necessarily shifting away from the values and the sort of institutional benefits that it has to participate in the ICC, but we're sort of against the institution. And you must understand that South Africa has tried at every angle to try and reform the institution from within, and none of its proposals which were brought forward to the ICC have ever taken any form of progress or have ever materialized in real reform in the institution itself.
Interesting issue. That's Siaduma Beniza. That's his Finance and Operations Director at Political Economy, Southern Africa.